Hey there everyone, it's Joe and welcome back to my channel. If you've not seen me before, then you're in the right place if you're wanting to learn a bit more about the Final Fantasy TCG, and if you have been here before, then you've probably noticed that I've not been here for a little while. It's been a minute, being honest, and to be honest with you, the reason for that is because I've not had time to be able to play anything recently. I've had a lot of kind of heavy things in my life going on, and I'm not going to bore you with the details of it or anything, but I didn't want to bring anybody kind of half-assed ideas or things that I didn't feel were correct, because whenever I build you a deck or a deck to kind of show you guys, I do test them, I do try and make sure that they are, as good as they can be, but I haven't been able to travel to tournaments very much recently. I unfortunately will not be attending UK Nationals this weekend or the last qualifier for Euros due to, there's a lot going on work-wise and life-wise, and again, I won't bore you with the details, but I wanted to make sure that I could check in with you guys because it has been a while, and I wanted to show you a deck that I did very heavily consider playing for Nationals if I was able to go. And if you wanted to have a good look at the kind of my way of building the Cadets from Type 0, then look no further and keep on watching. So this deck is all about removal. The whole deck is just very, very heavy removal. If you're a black-red player from Magic, then this will be right up your alley, because it's all about just destroying things and getting your opponent's head caved in as quickly as possible. And we're going to go straight in with the lightning forwards here. And the first two are Type 0 Cadets, and the first one is Seiss. Seiss is just an exceptional 2 CP unit that can only just get stronger and stronger and stronger as you manage to build up your resources, and she's just very, very good at getting stuff out of the way. Now, the fire portion of this deck is something that relies on a lot of burn effects, and there's a lot of effects in the game that counteract that kind of thing. However, Seiss makes that a little bit easier by dropping their power rather than hurting them through damage. So you can kind of add those two kind of things together and marry them up, and then you end up with a lot of removal in very, very quick succession. And Seiss can actually just make your opponent's life really difficult, and your opponent will not want to block her, especially if you have a multitude of the Type 0 units out. Although this deck isn't actually fully going into the Type 0 units, it's actually quite a small engine in comparison to a lot of the Type 0 decks that I've seen. There's only a few of the forwards, and there's a lot more to it than just Type 0. It's not necessarily a themed deck, but Seiss is just very, very good on her own, and her S ability can make things really difficult for your opponent and make them even less inclined to block you. And because she drops their power until the end of the turn, you're allowed to then open them up for everything else that you're playing. And she works in very, very good combination with the other Type 0 card that we're going to be talking about just now in 9, and 9 is one of the power hitters of this deck. There aren't a huge amount of really powerful units in this deck, but 9 makes himself stronger very, very quickly by attacking, and if you've got like Seiss and 9, it's all about mathematics, this deck. It's all about like having the incremental parts of 1,000 just changing, and so that the momentum swings in your favour by dropping their power and raising your own, or just burning them off the board entirely. And 9 is just like, he's a game winner. There's a lot of smaller units in here, or units that cheat other units in, and 9's S ability to stop your opponent from blocking at all can just win you the game there and then. And 9 is something I've discovered that people will go to great lengths to get rid of as soon as you play him, because he's just that much of a threat. And when it comes to Ace, which we'll get to later, the bonuses that Ace provides him make him a massive force to be reckoned with. So for me, he overtakes the place of King, which is the 5 CP Type 0 unit, because I don't think you need anything that expensive in this deck. There's all of the units in this deck are actually very cheap, so it's very easy to accumulate an army very quickly, much like what Mono Water does, which this deck does cater to, despite the fact that you would believe that it would be a poor matchup for it due to the fire burn and the way that fire usually works. And then we have 2 copies of Alcid, 2 copies of Onion Knight, and 2 copies of Rigdia, because that combo is just good. If you play Lightning, you play this combo. And one thing that I will note that is very nice with Alcid in this particular deck is that he can also cheat out Seiss. He's, if you've got something small that you don't really want to deal with, then you can use Alcid and cheat Seiss in, or you could use it in combination with some of the fire cards in this deck so that you still get a Seiss, which is a different trigger to Alcid than Onion Knight or Rigdia, and then burn them off the board with something else, like Cater, who we'll get to later. Yeah, see how I did that? And then lastly, we've got 4 copies of Gilgamesh, 2 copies of the Opus 3 one, which can wreck your opponent's board if left unchecked. Like, it depends on matchup, and this card, or both of the Gilgameshes are here for different reasons. Water is the Opus 3 Gilgamesh's worst nightmare. However, the starter deck Gilgamesh that we have in here is water's worst nightmare, because you can't bounce it, or your opponent can't Leviathan, they can't Sildra, they can't do anything to it, and he can make himself bigger and make himself really scary, so your opponent's not going to want to attack you, and you just stunt your opponent's water deck's momentum very quickly. So having the two of them together, and we have the hero one from Opus 3 be able to be used as a cost for the divider on the starter deck Gilgamesh, means that they just blend very well together in this deck, and they fulfill different functions while catering to different decks in the meta. If the winning deck at US Nationals ran a lot of smaller units, and relied on them not being able to be killed, then the hero Gilgamesh can actually really do some damage to that kind of deck. Also, I did want to say a quick congratulations to Joe, who was the winner of US Nationals. His deck was genius and I loved it. Again, I've not been around for a little while, but I have been in the back burner and I've been trying to keep up with everything that's going on as best I can. So congratulations to the US Nats winner. Definitely really awesome deck and I loved it. In fact, I liked all the top 8. I'll do a video on that later. Anyway, going back to this deck, and the fire forwards in this deck include Sink, or Sank, pretty sure it's Sink at this point, who is part of the reason that the Type 0 Cadets gel so well. You can use Sink and Sice together to make it so that your opponent's smaller guys are, it's very difficult for your opponent to get anywhere with them, and Sink and 9 make it so that even your opponent's bigger guys can't do an awful lot. And Sink, just by being a Type 0 Cadet, buffs both of those units just naturally. By, Sice's power gets stronger, Sice's ability gets stronger, and 9's power gets stronger, just by having her there. And, just by having the little chip damage, you can take out bigger threats with her. She's just a very, very good unit. And most fire decks run her anyway. One of the things that I've tried to do here is I haven't tried to cater too hard into a Type 0 theme, as so much as just using the ones that are good in and of themselves. However, the exception to that rule would be Ace, where Ace is only here as a power booster and as a Type 0. However, as I said earlier, this deck is all about mathematics, and Ace is there to double up on Sice and 9's abilities. Bearing in mind that he gives them 1000 power, he is also a Type 0 unit, so therefore their power is increased by another 1000 just by him being there. I didn't want to go for 3 copies of him because, as I said, I didn't want to delve too heavily into the Type 0 theme, but he does do the job very, very well. I didn't originally run him when I tried this deck out to begin with, and the S ability is there's no point in using it in this deck because there aren't enough Type 0 guys in here to warrant it, and it's very luck heavy anyway, and I don't particularly like that ability, but he's on curve at 7k for 3 CP. He's just good for the intended purpose, but 2 of them is enough. And then Firion can trigger a lot of the other abilities in this deck. For example, you could play if they haven't got a Minwu out, because Minwu is something we'll get to at the end of the deck, but Minwu is something that can cause problems for this deck. But if you wanted to, you could play a Firion and then use Sice to finish them off. You could use Cater to finish them off. You can use a lot of different things that your opponent isn't going to think about just by playing a Firion, and he's one of the larger units in this deck alongside Gilgamesh and 9, and he can just he's there to trigger a lot of the other abilities. He can trigger the Black Mage that can kill any damage forward, doing little chips of damage. I normally hate, I really don't like that mechanic in this game because there are hard counters to it, but when playing this deck, and I did play this a lot before I kind of fell off the map a little bit, and it really worked. And this is including against Mono Lightning, Mono Water, Earth decks. It did do very, very well. So I did very seriously consider playing this deck for Nationals, having tested it alongside a couple of others, which I'll probably get to after Nationals is finished. And then lastly, for the fire forwards, we have 2 copies of Vivi, who, one of the reasons I really like this deck is it punishes your opponent no matter what they do. And my favourite way to play a card game is to put your opponent in difficult positions where they don't know what they want to do, and then they make a mistake and you capitalise on it. Much like a fighting game. And people who know me know that I'm very into my fighting games like Street Fighter, and it's very similar mentality. Vivi punishes your opponent for holding back too much and keeping all their stuff in their hand. So you just play a guy and it just wipes something out. That's great. However, if they play their hand down and they're playing lots of smaller guys and they're just rushing all of their cards down, your Type 0 units deal with them instead, as does Gilgamesh. So it's a damned if you do, damned if you don't kind of situation. And I've only gone with 2 VVs here. You can run 3. 3 is also pretty good, but the S ability is very, very rarely relevant. Like, I have had a situation where I've used it or wanted to use it, but honestly, I would rather just play him, kill something, leave him as a blocker for the next turn, he dies, and then you play another one. That's the best way to play VV in my opinion. Moving into the backups now, for Lightning, we've gone with 2 copies of Black Mage because it is very, very easily triggered in this deck, and instead of... I always used to really like the Black Mage that dropped your opponent's power by 4k, and it would actually be quite fitting for this deck, but I felt that this one was better because instead of just making something weaker, it just outright kills something. And, you know, given that there's a lot of ways of dealing small amounts of damage, this thing absolutely destroys people if you have Hero Gilgamesh out using the fire ability to deal 2k to one thing, kill it, and then use the rest of my fire CP on something else to kill it. It's just very, very good in here. And then 2 copies of Sage because it's pretty much a staple in most Lightning decks, and given that we do quite like a lot of the S abilities in this deck, because a lot of the units in here have them, 9 has one, Sice has one, Sync has one, Starter Gilgamesh has one. There's loads and loads and loads. So it's very, very prudent to run Sage in order to be able to trigger those abilities as often as possible and play mind games with your opponent if you already have something like Sice out, to put one in your hand so that your opponent's going to go, oh, he can drop my power at any time. Or you can recur VVs. It's just very good. And then 2 copies of Orisha Al-Rasha, which is the searcher for all the Type 0 units, and I went with 2 copies of her as opposed to 1 copy of her and 1 copy of Gramis, which would have been able to search Al-Cid, because in testing I found that I didn't want Al-Cid as often as I wanted more of the Type 0 units. Yes, you can argue that there's a difference, you know, running one of each means that you can have both of them out at the same time, but in my opinion I prefer to have the consistency of the Type 0 units. And then 2 copies of Red Mage because this card could just win you games out of nowhere. Play a card, give it hazed, attack, win. You know, that's a very, very standard play in this game, but it's still a very, very good one, and I wouldn't omit it. And then lastly we have 1 copy of Ninja because, you know, there's a lot of situations where you can't deal just that single bit of damage to trigger Black Mage or trigger Cater and stuff like that, but this card kind of enables that, but I only wanted to run 1 copy of it in here, mainly because I didn't have a lot of room, and I didn't really want to make too much room for him because things like Minwu exist and stuff, and I'd rather have the ability to run cards like Orisha and Sage and things like that and have consistency rather than combo plays. And then moving into the fire backups, we've got 2 copies of Cater, who honestly I wrote off as a terrible, terrible card. When I saw it, and I thought, why would anyone ever run this in a Type 0 deck? I swear to God, this card won me so many games. It increases the power of VV. That's the best way I've tried to look at it. As long as there isn't a Minwu on the board, because then she's useless. Well, semi-useless. She triggers VV, she triggers all of the power abilities of the... well, she triggers Sice's ability, because Sice's is the only ability that triggers off of the number of Class 0 cadet characters you have as opposed to forwards. However, the amount that actually comes into effect is staggering, and when you have your Ace, your Sync, your Sice, your Cater, if you manage to assemble all of the pieces, then you're just going to be wrecking face for the rest of the game until they deal with it. But even then, even with only small segments of the combos, it still does a lot of work. And Cater is a 2 CP fire backup anyway, so she can pay towards Gilgamesh. I didn't play her when I first built the deck, and then after a while I thought, oh, I'll give her a go, and I loved it. Absolutely loved it. I can only sing praises for Cater in this deck. Try it, just trust me on this. And then we've gone with 2 copies of Summoner, which I like mainly because it's a backup that can just break itself whenever you want, and it also makes VV stronger, it also makes things like Cater stronger. It also means that combat is a lot harder for your opponent because your smaller guys can take out bigger guys, and it's a lot of mind games. You don't have to run Summoner, you could run Bard from Opus 3 instead, because you have like a nice small army of guys that you could just go, oh, well, my guys have 2Ks, rush in for game. But I liked the fact that Summoner didn't have any other costs to him, so I just wanted to be, if I wanted to make room for something else, I could do that. And that's why I decided on the Summoner. And then 2 copies of Black Waltz 2, much for the same reason as VV. It triggers Cater, it triggers all of the like Onion Knight. This deck is really, really good at playing Onion Knight on its own, because there's so many ways of dealing small amounts of damage and then playing Onion Knight to finish it off. You don't require Al-Cid. Obviously it's better to have him and Onion Knight in your hand at the same time, but if you draw Onion Knight without Al-Cid, or Al-Cid without Onion Knight for that matter, you often find you're still able to play them, and that's one of the beauties of this deck. Black Waltz 2 helps trigger that. It adds to the EX count, which there isn't a huge amount of EX bursts in this deck, but honestly people seem to be coming away from the luck element of the game, which I sometimes disagree with that, and I'll get to that in another video at some point, because I think that luck is a part of these games and people should embrace it as opposed to fight against it. And yeah, it's just a solid card. It's a good removal piece. It can allow you guys to swing in. It's just pretty good. I really enjoy the card. And then 2 copies of Red Mage, because like the Lightning Red Mage, this card just goes in fire decks. It stops your opponent from blocking, and if you've got a small guy and their opponent has a bigger guy and you've managed to kill the smaller ones, they still can't stop you, and that's great. And unless they have an Aerith out, but like, you know, that's why I've tried to make it so that there's lots of different blanket effects as opposed to things. I've tried to bear in mind all of the cards that people run as anti-meta cards, things like Aerith, things like Minwu, while still being able to run these burn effects. So I do try and keep those things in mind. And then lastly, there's a copy of Selfie in here because it's just a great card, but I've never really needed to run more than 1 copy of it, and it also, it greatly benefits Seiss more than anybody else, purely because swinging your power up and their power down usually results in you winning combat. And that is the biggest point of this deck. Just winning combat, destroying their forwards, just whittle their resources down as much as you can, and then punish them with cards like VV and Black Waltz if they don't try and match you momentum wise. And I honestly, I've really enjoyed it. And then the last part of the deck is the summons, and there's only 7 summons in this deck because I actually ended up finding myself taking some out in order to cater to more forwards instead. I'm only running 1 copy of 2 different Odins, and the first one is the kill anything of cost 4 or less from Opus 1, because I do like to have a single copy of it, as there's a lot of cards that I would want to kill, but with cards like Garnet being quite so popular, and you know, there's a lot of things that are difficult to target at the moment, I don't really want to run too many of it. And similarly, I'm running 1 copy of the Opus 3 Odin for the same reason. There are cards, they're basically just covering my backside, basically. Like, there are cards that I want to be able to deal with, and because there's quite so many Type 0 units in here, I can get away with running a 1-of Odin and be able to use it consistently. And if I can't, I can throw it away and not worry about it. And then 2 copies of Cyclops, because it works in tandem with all of the burn effects in the deck. It works in tandem with things like Seiss. It just works very, very well. And your opponent, you know, combat tricks win in this game. Golem does it in Earth. Belias does it in Fire, which we'll get to in a second. And Cyclops does it really well in Lightning. It doesn't target your opponent's guy at all, so therefore it just works very, very well. And then with the Fire summons, I've gone for 2 copies of Belias, pretty much because it draws a card. And it is very, very good. I did consider 2 copies of Brynhilda instead, which I don't ordinarily like, but I do think it would work very well in here because it can remove smaller threats off the board before you can do anything. And in combination with Cater, you can deal a lot of damage very quickly. But I decided to go with Belias because I wanted to focus more heavily on the combat trick side of the deck rather than the burn side. And lastly, a copy of Bahamut, because the number of times where Bahamut has won me a game is huge. Like, I mean, just burning 2 guys off the board, the only thing that can really stop you with that is Cecil. And, you know, Cecil does kind of impede this deck quite nastily, but you still have outs to it. You still have outs in, you know, Seiss can still do a lot of work to him. He has to block. This deck is all about combat, so you just have to remember that, and you should be fine. I mean, yes, he can be a bit of a pain in the butt, but if you have enough Type 0 guys, because Cecil's never going to usually attack you unless he has to, because you can deal with it, but that's why Cyclops and Seiss and things like that are in the deck, so that you can beat that kind of card. But Bahamut, past that, rinses most cards, and it's just solid as a 1-of, and if, you know, I didn't want to run more than 1 because I didn't want to delve too heavily into it, because it's extremely expensive, and this deck is all about cheaper guys, or cheaper cards in general, but it can save you, and like if your opponent's about to try and kill you and you just can Bahamut them, it's an emergency button, more or less, and I like it for that reason. So yeah, that's the whole of this deck, and honestly in testing, I mean, I haven't tested it for a couple of weeks, admittedly, but it had a positive matchup against Mono Water, which really surprised me, as I honestly thought it was going to really struggle, but I have noticed a lot of Mono Water decks are foregoing things like Minwu and Cecil and getting rid of their defensive plays in order to make a more aggressive play, and this can easily keep up with the momentum of a water deck, and I like it for that reason. It does very well against Mono Lightning, because things like Alcid and Onion Knight, things like that, tend to focus on singular targets, and if you've got a ton of different targets, then Lightning tends to struggle a little bit more because it has no kind of extra board wipes, as it were. It doesn't, apart from X-Death, which is starting to see a little bit of play now, and that's kind of cool, but past that, I mean, no deck is perfect, but I'm outlining the decks that I think can beat this, and the deck, because I did think about running this deck for Nationals a lot, and I wasn't 100% certain I was going to do it. I was considering mono wind, I was considering mono earth, I was considering mono water even. But I tried to go against the grain, and I didn't want to run the Zac, Cloud and Geel part of Fire and Lightning, because I think a lot of people have already kind of seen it and catered to it, and I don't really care about whether I win these tournaments or anything and like that. I just want to be able to show some people something new. And one thing I really like about this deck is it's not particularly expensive. The only legends in this deck are 2 copies of Eevee and a Valhalla. Everything else is hero or below. And you know, I want to kind of show that you can do really well with these in these games and in these tournaments without having to fork out a fortune, because you don't have to. You know, this deck, honest to God, really enjoyed and did very well with it locals and things like that. And I hope that you guys do too. Like I said, I can't come to Nationals this weekend, and I really wish I could, but things just get in the way, and I really hope that those of you who are going have a really good time. And you know, feel free to message me with your experience and stuff like that, because I'd love to hear from you guys. I haven't heard from anybody in a little while, to be honest. Like, you know, as I say, I've not been around for a little while, but honestly I'm sure half of you haven't even noticed. So I hope you're having a really good time, and those of you who do go to Nationals, I hope you have a great time there this weekend. And again, congrats to those that did really well at US Nationals as well, and it'd be great to hear from you, from the guys who went to the US as well, because get in touch. It'd be nice to hear from everybody. And I apologise if I haven't been around for a little while, but I'm getting back on track with it all, and hopefully I won't be missing many videos more in the future. So subscribe to the channel if you haven't already, or if you want to see more of what I do and things like that. There's plenty of other videos coming up. Like, I'm trying to get my artwork going again and things like that, so that'll be something to look forward to. And yeah, just thumbs up on the video and make comments and do your thing when it comes to the YouTube stuff. So thank you very much for watching, and I'll speak to you again soon. Bye.